Hey there, everybody. My name is Chris, and this is All Decks Welcome. If you're anything like me, then you've had your Commander Play group grown up basically any mana curve you build in a deck. As a ramp player, I have a tendency to have all my cards grouped at 2, 3, and 7 mana, giving any mana curve I make these nice walls separating everything else. One part of that curve I never neglect, though, is the 1-drop spot in a deck. Your opening play can be the most valuable play of the game sometimes, whether it's a mana dork letting you get to more valuable cards faster, or that first creature swinging in at your opponent as soon as possible. It's not unusual to see that early advantage pay off in a big way. Today I want to talk about 1-drops that are so powerful that they support everything the deck does, or even have entire decks built around them. One for each color, so no one ends up feeling left out. Which means if we're following proper Wooburg, we start with white and the namesakes of a deck known as Soul Sisters. Soul's Attendant and Soul Warden, functional reprints of each other and easy cards to underestimate. Soul Sisters as a deck is built around the singular line of text: when a creature enters the battlefield, gain 1 life, letting you take your sweet time against aggro and letting you pull out of range from a lackluster turn for a Storm player. But of course, these two can't win a game without some help. The list of cards that have assisted them throughout their run have taken a lot of forms, starting with powerful creatures like a Johnny's Pridemate, using your life gain to turn into a much larger threat. Heliod Suncrown now giving the deck a reasonable card to cast that grants the effect to the Soul Sisters themselves. Or you could put those counters on creatures like Squadron Hawk, who let you build up a much larger board state without worrying as much about blocking, supported even further with more +1/+1 effects. Maybe most famously Gideon ally of Zendikar, since he pulls triple duty as heavy pressure against control and a source of tokens in a board stall situation. And then there's the more explosive versions of the deck. My personal favorite still being one with Archangel of Thune and the White Hideaway land to surprise your opponent with a huge upswing in life and power with even 1 or 2 Soul Sisters on board. Other threats a Soul Sister deck tends to utilize are also just tracking where all that life gain has gone you, such as Sarah Ascendant giving you an incredibly powerful threat very early in the game that only pulls you further and further away from your opponent. Or a Johnny, Strength of the Pride, to remove all blockers and obstacles your opponent is holding up to try and keep your creatures away. The effect of the Soul Sisters is straightforward and seems unassuming, but sometimes the best Magic cards are exactly that: simple, unimpressive cards that everything else can spring off of for greater value. If we want to talk about how unassuming a deck can be, though, we need to talk about blue, and it's Golden Boy. One of the best creatures the color has ever gotten, let alone one of its best 1-drop creatures. Delver of Secrets isn't a card that supports the rest of the deck. He's simply what you use to kill your opponent while denying them a proper game of Magic. A 1/1 for 1 blue who's just waiting for your draw step, and an instant or sorcery to become a 3/2 flyer you'll be hammering into your opponent with for however long the game continues. This boy sees most of his play in Legacy and Pauper. Legacy being able to use its free counterspells to keep him away from early removal, both formats having Brainstorm and Ponder to easily set up his flip on your opponent's end step, and from generally more efficient protective spells like the original counterspell to back him up. The simple power of a card that plays as efficiently as it does next to a bolt and counter magic setup is too much to try and ignore. In Legacy, the decks built around him have had a long history near the top of the format in a variety of different colors. While Pauper typically restricts him to pure blue or Dimir, this creature defines what tempo looks like in 2 different formats, probably making it one of the most impressive 1-drop creatures in Magic's history. If we want to talk about the most powerful 1-drops ever printed, though, then black has a major contender. Yeah, sorry, we're actually not going to talk about Death's Shadow here. It's an archetype I've had a lot of interest in for a long time, but I've also never really explored like I really want to. Expect a full video about him all on his own and the concept of the 52 card deck someday in the future. Instead, let's talk about a creature who only seems to find more synergies every time I see him in a new deck: Knight of the Ebon Legion. A 1/2 for 1 mana isn't very exciting, even with a 3 mana pump ability that also gives Death Touch. He'd make a fine creature if that was all he had, but nothing as exciting as he actually is. No, what makes this creature so exciting is all the ways you can abuse its ability to get stronger every time a player loses a chunk of their life total. Thoughtseize is already one of the most played black spells in the game, and once you're done paying its 2 life and a shock land costing you another 2, then you can find yourself buffing your creature even when you can't swing in for damage. His own pump ability puts him above the curve of most 3 mana cards, even trading with Pioneer powerhouses like Steel Leaf Champion and standard threats like Yorvo. Even Lovestruck Beast is in danger, if only because of that all too relevant Death Touch. If your opponent chooses not to trade, though, they can be in even more dangerous territory, since holding up 3 mana can mean representing a kill spell or the buff ability, letting him eat the larger creatures with even 1 counter and applying a lot of pressure and uncertainty in otherwise simple aggro strategies. The number of times I've seen people have to feed a creature to chump block him trying not to let him grow bigger is astonishing when you remember he comes down for 1 mana. He's not a card he can build around on his own, but he's a card that from turn 1 changes how your opponent views the board in a way that few other 1-drop cards, creature or otherwise, can. Then there's Red. Red could have an entire video series talking about the ranking system of all the various 1-drop creatures the color has had over the course of its life. This took a lot of soul searching to try and figure out what best represented the color and all the ways its 1-drops could be useful, but in the end I decided to give the award to one that isn't the strongest play on turn 1, but sets up a lot of punishment later on. Monastery Swiftspear is Pioneer's golden girl of mono red 1-drops, and the one I hear modern players discuss in depth when trying to compare it to Goblin Guide. When you take into account being able to throw a lightning bolt followed by Skewer the Critics on turn 2 for 9 damage, after a hasty point of damage turn 1, you've already knocked your opponent down half their life total, and that's not even touching on options like Lava Spike, Rift Bolt, and Light Up the Stage, giving you even more incredibly powerful spells, all for 1 mana, and one of them even helping you find more of the same to continue pushing damage into your opponent's rapidly overwhelmed board. Not losing out on damage from burn spells thrown at creatures is another huge benefit for the Swiftspear. Prow is quickly counting up how punished your opponent feels watching everything they have go up in flames. Then of course you get her versatility outside of mono red. A blue-red blitz deck uses her to make cantripping through the deck as effective as possible, while green gives you a range of pump spells and trample giving spells to let her act as a full-on battering ram through an opponent's line. Monastery Swiftspear is one of those creatures that just sings and is going to be a hard card to ever replace. Which finally brings us to green. I could just slap a mana dork here and call it good, but that would honestly feel against the spirit of things. Red decks monopolize on the advantage of their early creatures. Most green decks will eventually find their mana, and losing a turn 1 dork just decides how explosive the deck can be unless you're running 20 of them, in which case, hi, nice elves deck you've got there. Instead, let's swerve into another creature that becomes a major problem for your opponent in a similar way that Night of the Ebon Legion does. Pelk Collector. This is a card with a very special place in my heart, but at base he is a lackluster 1/1 for 1 green. He has grand ambitions though and isn't going to be left in the dust. Anything coming in bigger than him drives him to work even harder, netting him another +1/+1 counter unless he's caught up. But it isn't just watching his rivals show up that causes him to grow. When something bigger than him passes on, he picks up the slack and grows again, eventually reaching 3 counters and gaining the ability to trample over an opponent. This is a threat that never stops getting more pressing, growing larger than the knight in most games, but lacking its flexibility. You also see it benefiting from high synergy in the way that Delver does. Green Stompy decks already play as efficient creatures as possible to knock down their opponent's life total 1 chunk at a time, and your opponent has to decide between dealing with those or keeping the Pelk Collector from getting out of hand. If Green's goal is to grow out of control, then Pelk Collector does a great job of embodying that, especially when backed up by creatures like Strangleroot Geist, who can pump him twice through the Undying ability, or ever-growing threats like Yorvo, Lord of Garenbrig, who guarantees that something will eventually be bigger to get Pelk Collector its next counter. And when you step out of green, you also get cards like Vexing Devil. Aha! Surprise 1-drop highlight! Vexing Devil being a 4/3 for 1 mana that your opponent can remove by taking 4 damage immediately, leading to a situation where on turn 2 you can get Pelk Collector to a 3/3 after your opponent already had to lose a chunk of their life. Actually, Vexing Devil also works together well with Night of the Ebon Legion. And this, everyone, is how really silly deck ideas come to exist. Talking about valuable cards that are fun to play, and then shoving them together. Of course, this is only scratching the surface of good 1-drop creatures. I know plenty of modern Pioneer players who would want my head for not properly bringing up Experiment 1 versus Pelk Collector. A debate that if you have in the comments, I simply ask you to please remain civil about. While you're down there though, make sure to throw out your own favorite picks. Maybe throw out some suggestions for the best opening enchantments while you're at it. A solid base can do just as much, if not more, as an aggressive lead does. If you enjoyed my personal picks to talk about, or just want to lurk around waiting for when I feel ready to talk about Death's Shadow, please like and subscribe. I promise that I'll be making more content like this in the future, and that anything that plays with the very mechanics of the game, like Death's Shadow does, is sure to get its day in the sun on this channel. Make sure to stay safe, have fun games, bolt the bird, and practice good habits, everybody.